Picture a cold March night in 1941, a slender steel hull cutting through the dark Atlantic swell as sonar pings echo across icy waters. On board, Commander Gunther Preen and his crew of U-47 were still riding high on the fame of their near-legendary raid on Scapa Flow in 1939. Yet in the span of a few hours, that same submarine would slip into the depths and into legend, leaving no survivors, no wreckage, and one of World War II's most haunting maritime mysteries. U-47 was a Type 7B U-boat commissioned into Germany's Kriegsmarine in December 1938. When war broke out in 1939, Preen and his crew embarked on their first wartime patrols, soon making history. In the early hours of October 14th, 1939, U-47 penetrated the British Royal Navy's main anchorage at Scapa Flow in Scotland, a feat considered nearly impossible at the time. The crew torpedoed the battleship HMS Royal Oak at anchor. The surprise attack sent the aging battleship to the bottom in minutes. News of this stunning event reverberated through Germany, Britain, and the entire world. For the German Navy, the sinking of Royal Oak was eagerly seized upon to tout the prowess of their U-boat strategy against the powerful Royal Navy. Preen instantly became a national hero, and the U-47 crew was invited to Berlin for a celebratory reception. Preen was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, making him the first U-boat sailor and only the second Kriegsmarine member to receive Germany's highest military honor at that stage. Preen earned the nickname the Bull of Scapa Flow after this bold raid, and a snorting bull emblem was painted on U-47 in his honor. That emblem soon became the symbol of the 7th U-boat flotilla itself, underscoring just how legendary U-47's victory was for the German Naval Command. After the October 1939 raid, U-47 continued to prowl the Atlantic and proved to be one of Germany's most effective submarines in the early war. Over the course of 10 combat patrols, Preen and his men spent 238 days at sea and sank 31 ships, including 30 merchant ships and 1 warship, totaling over 160,000 gross registered tons. Tonnage sunk is the U-boat's scorecard, the total weight of all the ships it sent to the bottom. By tracking how many tons of enemy shipping a submarine destroys, commanders and planners get a clear, comparable measure of how hard each boat is hitting the enemy's supply lines. Notably, this tally made the sub the 13th most successful U-boat of World War II in terms of tonnage sunk. Among U-47's victims was the Arandora Star, a British passenger ship sunk in July 1940 during one of U-47's patrols that claimed 8 ships in a single mission. U-47 also boldly attacked the battleship HMS Warspite in the North Sea in April 1940, although that torpedo failed to detonate and the submarine had to evade depth charges. Crucially, U-47's string of successes played a significant role in the wider Battle of the Atlantic, where Germany sought to sever Britain's supply lifelines. Every merchant ship sunk contributed to the tonnage war, aiming to starve Britain of supplies. Preen's accomplishments were not only military feats, but also valuable propaganda for the regime. The German public followed the U-boat aces much like fighter aces. Each new success was trumpeted in news reports. By early 1941, U-47 had become a symbol of German naval success against the much more conventionally superior Royal Navy. The achievement of the crew buoyed German confidence that U-boats could turn the tide of the war, which made what happened next all the more impactful. In February 1941, U-47 prepared to sail on what would be its 10th and final combat patrol. The strategic situation had evolved since U-47's early exploits. Germany now had U-boat bases on the Atlantic coast of occupied France, particularly in Lorient and Brittany, allowing submarines to strike the North Atlantic convoy routes more easily. While the Germans were better positioned, Allied convoys were much better defended than in 1939. Preen and his crew departed Lorient on the 20th of February 1941, leading U-47 back into the North Atlantic fray. At this point, he was a veteran commander, and his crew was experienced and battle-hardened. U-47's final mission took it into the North Atlantic, south of Iceland, to intercept outbound British convoys. In early March, Preen was operating in concert with several other U-boats as they hunted a westbound convoy. On the 6th to 7th of March 1941, U-47 made contact with a convoy and began attacks under cover of darkness. Preen launched torpedoes at the convoy ships, scoring at least one successful hit. On March 7th, Preen lived out the wildest fantasy of Sea Shepherd activists and torpedoed a large whale factory ship of over 20,000 tons, crippling the vessel permanently. The convoy's escorts, which included the British destroyers HMS Wolverine and HMS Verity, along with two corvettes, HMS Camellia and HMS Arbutus, reacted swiftly to the threat. Just after midnight, going into March 8th, the British escorts began a fierce counterattack. What follows next is the official story, as it was believed by the Admiralty at the time. For the next several hours, they played a deadly cat-and-mouse game with the lurking U-boat. According to Royal Navy reports, Wolverine and Verity took turns using their sonar to track a submarine and launched patterns of depth charges into the icy waters. The chase went on for about 5 hours, well into the pre-dawn of March 8th. At one point, around 5 a.m., U-47 was apparently forced to surface, or came shallow enough for lookouts on Wolverine to glimpse it briefly before it submerged again. The destroyers boxed the U-boat in, dropping dozens of depth charges. Suddenly, a powerful explosion was noted beneath the surface, sending an orange-red glow into the depths that was visible from the escorts above. After that, there was only silence, and the British believed they had finally destroyed Preen's submarine and avenged the October 1939 attack on Scapa Flow. Back in Germany, however, U-47's fate was still unknown that morning. The last radio message from Preen had been received at around 5 a.m. on the 7th of March, a full 24 hours before the disappearance. When U-47 then failed to report its position or return to port, it was quietly noted to be missing. Germany was slow to acknowledge the loss of one of its most celebrated heroes. In fact, the authorities kept Preen's disappearance secret for as long as possible, over 2 months, to avoid a hit to public morale. Meanwhile, in Britain, officials strongly suspected Preen had been eliminated based upon the reports of the Wolverine and the Verity. Prime Minister Winston Churchill even announced to Parliament that Preen was presumed dead. British propagandists taunted German radio listeners with the repeated question, "Where is Preen?" By late May 1941, the German High Command could no longer hide the obvious. The Bull of Scapa Flow was gone. On May 23rd, they reluctantly informed the nation that U-47 was missing and presumed lost. From the moment Preen and company failed to return, questions arose as to what exactly happened in that dark March night. At the time, the Royal Navy credited HMS Wolverine with the victory. British reports of the convoy battle describe Wolverine and Verity's coordinated depth charge attack and the sighting of a submarine's destruction. This led the Admiralty to conclude that U-47 had been sunk by these escorts west of Ireland. This version of events became the widely accepted story during and immediately after the war, that Preen had fallen victim to the convoy's escorts after a prolonged hunt. Indeed, the Royal Navy's public announcement that Wolverine sank the notorious U-47 was trumpeted as a much-needed victory against the U-boat menace. However, with no wreckage or survivors to confirm, this account was never certain. Post-war analysis and scholarship have cast significant doubt on the Wolverine theory. Research later revealed that the submarine attacked by Wolverine was likely not U-47 at all, but another U-boat operating in the same area. This submarine, commanded by Hans Eckermann, survived serious damage from depth charges and limped back to base at Lorient on March 18, 1941. Hans Eckermann's overlapping verified account of combat with the Wolverine and Verity raised the question of what actually happened to the sub. One theory is that U-47 was caught and sunk by the other escorts a bit later than the Wolverine attack. 2 corvettes were also active in the convoy defense, and reportedly carried out a separate depth charge attack on a U-boat contact. However, no confirmed U-boat victory was recorded by them at the time. It remains possible their attack fatally damaged U-47, even if they didn't realize it. Under this theory, it's possible that the sub attempted to return to German-occupied territory, though historians generally consider this somewhat unlikely due to the lack of a distress signal. That said, it remains a possibility that the ship had lost its ability to send such a signal due to severe damage. Another possibility is that U-47 struck a naval mine. The waters south of Iceland weren't a heavily mined area compared to the North Sea, but mines can't be entirely ruled out. A drifting mine or a minefield from an Allied operation might have been in the vicinity and could have blown the submarine apart without warning. Given that no distress signal was sent, a sudden mine explosion could explain the boat's abrupt end. The reality of submarine warfare is that not all losses were due to enemy action. U-47 might have suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure or accident. For instance, a failure in the pressure hull, a leak leading to flooding, or a malfunction in the batteries could have doomed the sub during or after the convoy engagement. Such an internal failure in the heat of combat could cause a submarine to plunge to crushing depths with no chance to broadcast a distress signal. Intriguingly, one hypothesis is that U-47 fell victim to one of its own torpedoes. German U-boats in early 1941 were still using torpedoes that had notorious reliability problems. Some types of German torpedoes were known to run erratically, and under certain circumstances, a torpedo that missed its target could circle back. There are at least 3 documented cases of U-boats being struck by their own torpedo after it looped around. If U-47 fired a torpedo that failed to find a convoy target and instead circled, it could have struck the submarine that launched it. Outside the realm of likely scenarios, one less plausible option gained traction in the German media. In the 1960s, some accounts claimed that Prien and his crew weren't lost at sea at all, but were secretly captured and sent to a facility or camp, where they quickly perished. One rumor suggested that Prien had criticized the high command over the malfunctioning torpedoes and refused orders to continue patrol with flawed equipment. According to this theory, he threatened to go public with the concerns, which the high command was worried would impact their ability to gather sufficient seamen for the Battle of the Atlantic. That said, no evidence exists to support this theory. With decades of analysis and archival research, the current historical consensus is that U-47 was lost with all hands in the North Atlantic on March 8, 1941, or very soon after. No wreck of U-47 has ever been definitively identified on the ocean floor to provide forensic evidence. Modern assessments dismiss the original British claim that the Wolverine sank Prien's sub, since that destroyer likely engaged a different U-boat. Despite numerous potential theories, without the forensic evidence coming from the wreck itself, the exact fate of U-47 will remain one of the great unsolved mysteries of World War II. In the waning years of World War II, whispers spread of a secret German base somewhere near the top of the world. For decades, it was little more than a story, a remote Arctic outpost known by the evocative codename Schatzgräber, meaning treasure hunter. This isn't a typical story of looted treasure hidden in one of the world's most remote locations. Rather, it's the bizarre, untold tale of how Germany's northernmost base was taken down by a single polar bear. Despite its name, Schatzgräber appears to have simply been a weather station, though one of the most important ones of its period. In 1942, Germany's Navy, the Kriegsmarine, urgently needed accurate Arctic weather data to plan operations. During the battle for the Atlantic, Germany's Naval High Command relied heavily on the ability to accurately forecast the weather in the North Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. Storms, sea ice, and gales could decide the fate of ships and U-boats. Having such a weather station would allow Germany to gain an advantage by predicting weather in Northern Europe and the North Atlantic. Since Allied forces were sinking Germany's weather ships with increasing frequency, the German command devised a network of secret land-based weather stations in the Arctic. Operation Schatzgräber was one of the most audacious of these efforts, particularly because it was deep within Soviet territory. Establishing this outpost was a formidable challenge. In September 1943, over a year after the operation was approved, a special expedition set sail from Germany, slipping through Arctic waters to reach the uninhabited, ice-covered Alexandra Land. This is a large uninhabited island north of Russia in the archipelago known as Franz Josef Land. A supply ship, guarded by a U-boat escort, carried a team of about 10 men, meteorologists, radio operators, and laborers, including one man who doubled as a cook. Keep this cook in mind for later, since he's going to play a big part in this story. They built prefabricated huts and labored to set up the station on a gravel spit about 100 feet above sea level, just inland from the frozen coast. The location was painstakingly chosen for its relative shelter and vantage point. By November 1943, the weather station was operational. Despite the extreme latitude and perpetual darkness of the Arctic winter, the team began transmitting regular weather reports. These reports were enciphered and radioed back to German headquarters, feeding into forecasts for German submarines lurking in the North Atlantic. With that, this German outpost deep in Soviet territory indirectly became one of the most dangerous weapons in the Battle of the Atlantic, and the Allies didn't even know it existed. Life at the Schatzgräber station was harsh, claustrophobic, and dangerous. The small team of Germans found themselves essentially marooned in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. During the long polar nights, they endured howling winds, sub-zero temperatures, and constant darkness, relieved only by feeble lamplight. The station's huts were stocked with canned food, ammunition, fuel, and scientific instruments. Outside, the crew laid defensive minefields and trenches around their perimeter, a precaution against any unwelcome visitors, whether curious polar bears or Soviet soldiers. Each man carried a rifle, prepared to do combat with either bear or man. In their downtime, the isolated crew read novels and played cards, trying to keep boredom and homesickness at bay. Sometimes the men got tired of the canned food they had to eat all the time, and evidently, some of the men longed for steaks, but we'll come back to that in a moment. The station's primary mission was meteorology, and the crew took painstaking measurements of temperature, air pressure, wind, and other atmospheric conditions at regular intervals. As the polar night gave way to daylight in early 1944, they also launched weather balloons with instruments to capture high-altitude data, tracking the powerful jet stream winds. The data was militarily vital, a treasure of forecasts that could give German U-boats and warships an edge in planning operations or evading storms. In a sense, the codename Treasure Hunter reflected the value of the prize they sought: accurate weather intelligence. To keep the station running, occasional supply drops were arranged. A long-range Condor aircraft would brave the Arctic skies to parachute crates of provisions, with each delivery being a lifeline in the Arctic void. Still, the men at Schatzgraber missed the sort of food they could only get in the fatherland, the sort of chow that somewhat ironically wasn't on the menu in a place called Franz Josef Land. For several months, the secret base functioned smoothly, though clearly not comfortably. By spring 1944, however, the strain of isolation and limited rations was taking its toll. The men grew weary of their diet of canned goods, and the local polar bears started looking less threatening and more delicious. In late May 1944, two of the weather station crew decided to supplement their food stores with fresh meat. Little did they know this hunting attempt would start an event which would ultimately bring this crucial weather station to a grinding halt. Spotting a polar bear near the camp, they managed to hunt the hulking animal successfully, in what surely felt like a major victory at the time. Unfortunately for them, none of the men at the base appear to have known the first thing about hunting bears. The station's cook carved thick steaks from the bear, and the men prepared for an ursine feast. Craving a taste of fresh protein, most of the men ate the bear meat undercooked, with some even treating it as a raw delicacy. To put it very mildly, these men were about to find out why you've never seen bear sashimi on the menu at an Alaskan sushi joint. Within days, a nightmare began to unfold. The cook himself fell gravely ill first, suffering severe leg pains and fever. One by one, nearly every member of the team was struck by mysterious agony, weakness, fever, muscle inflammation, and delirium. Only the station's medic, a man who decided to pass on the polar bear steaks, remained healthy. He soon suspected the cause: trichinosis, a parasitic infection contracted from eating raw or undercooked bear meat infested with tiny worms. The Schatzgraber crew had unwittingly poisoned themselves in their bid for a decent meal. As June 1944 wore on, the situation became desperate. The incapacitated team could barely carry out their duties, and weather reports grew infrequent as the men writhed in pain. Through fits of fever, they managed to radio for help. In response, the German Naval Command organized an ambitious rescue operation. A doctor was dispatched, flying out on a Condor aircraft from occupied Norway to reach the stricken station. Initially, the plan was to have the doctor parachute down to the island with medical supplies. But upon arrival over Alexandra Land in early July, the pilot took a bold risk. He landed the big 4-engine plane on a makeshift airstrip the crew had scraped onto the tundra. The landing was rough. The Condor's landing gear was damaged on the unforgiving ground, but it worked. The physician and pilot now found themselves amid the ailing men, treating the trichinosis victims on site, while urgent repairs were improvised on the plane. After frantic days of makeshift work on the plane, it was patched up well enough for a takeoff. On July 11, 1944, the crew went aboard the patched-up Condor, leaving their Arctic camp behind to be reclaimed by the triumphant remaining polar bears. The Condor barely managed to lift into the air, but it succeeded in evacuating the entire team to safety in Norway. The treasure hunter station, once so critical to German operations, was abruptly abandoned, brought down by a single dead polar bear. In their haste, the evacuees left huts, instruments, diaries, and personal belongings scattered about, and a ring of live landmines still hidden in the ground. For the remainder of World War II, Schatzgraber's site sat untended and forgotten by the outside world. Its existence had been top secret, so the Allies never knew to seek it out. In the immediate post-war years, the Soviet Union reasserted control over Franz Josef Land. In 1947, Soviet survey flights spotted the derelict camp on Alexandra Land. By the early 1950s, Soviet scientists even briefly used the abandoned facilities while establishing their own weather outpost nearby. They reportedly found some German supplies and makeshift shelters still intact. The old German mines, however, remained a deadly hazard, preventing further exploration of the site. Only in 1990 did an expedition finally clear the minefield, theoretically allowing further exploration to take place. Then history struck again, and the Soviet Union fell, and the site was forgotten for almost 3 decades more. It wasn't until 2016 that the site truly gave up its secrets. In that year, a Russian Arctic expedition, aided by an unusually warm summer that melted the ice cover, located and excavated the weather station's remains. What they found was a treasure trove of artifacts frozen in time. Rusted rifles, boxes of ammunition and grenades, radio equipment, piles of weather balloon fragments, diary pages and meteorological logs, all lay scattered in the Arctic soil. The Russian team even identified the flattened strip of tundra that had served as the emergency airfield for the daring 1944 rescue flight. Unsurprisingly, a secret German base codenamed Treasure Hunter has inspired its share of theories. Over time, some have speculated that the true mission of the outpost might have gone beyond weather reports. One persistent rumor held that the site doubled as a clandestine U-boat base to launch covert operations in the polar seas. Still others imagined that it was used as an outpost used to relocate wealth looted from across Europe during the war. The reality of Schatzgräber, however, appears far less fantastical, but no less fascinating. The archaeological evidence and surviving documents give no hint of any treasure other than extremely valuable meteorological data. The Russian researchers in 2016 found no evidence of a submarine base or any hidden vaults, just weather instruments, munitions, and everyday supplies needed to produce the data. That said, of course, many have questioned whether the true nature of the findings would have been publicized if more conventional treasure was found at the site. The Japanese effort to establish dominance over Asia both before and during World War II was fought in the name of Emperor Hirohito. As Japan's sovereign during the war, Hirohito presided over a campaign of aggressive expansion across Asia. Under his reign, the Imperial Japanese military committed widespread atrocities. These acts have gone down in the historical record as some of the worst acts committed in human history. Historians have long debated whether Hirohito was a powerless figurehead or an active enabler of Japan's aggression, or something in between. Modern research suggests that while he was not all-powerful by any means, he was far from blameless for the atrocities committed under his rule. Evidence shows he had knowledge of, and at times directly gave consent to, major war crimes. Japan's road to war was paved by imperial ambition and militarist ideology. Hirohito was revered under the state Shinto ideology as a divine leader, and this doctrine encouraged absolute obedience, Japanese supremacy, and expansionism over Asia. In the lead-up to the Second World War, Japan occupied Manchuria in 1931 and launched an invasion of China in 1937. Hirohito, as head of state, acquiesced to these moves and later approved attacking the Western Allies in 1941. Japanese expansionism was accompanied by brutal violence. Across Asia, occupying Japanese forces carried out massacres, pillage, forced labor, slavery, torture, and other atrocities on a vast scale. By war's end, millions of civilians and POWs had perished in the name of this so-called divine leader. In December 1937, Japanese troops captured Nanjing, then the capital of China, and proceeded to slaughter thousands upon thousands of Chinese prisoners and civilians. Estimates of the dead range from over 100,000 to as many as 200,000. Emperor Hirohito was far from the battlefield, but his decisions helped enable this atrocity. Just months earlier, in August 1937, Hirohito had ratified an army proposal to remove constraints of international law on the treatment of Chinese prisoners. In effect, he gave his military complete freedom to ignore the laws of war against the Chinese, a decision that paved the way for acts of untold brutality. During the Nanjing Rampage, one of Hirohito's uncles, Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, was a commander on the scene. Prince Asaka likely ordered his troops to execute all captives, though the order was lost in the chaos of war or intentionally destroyed after. Hirohito never punished the perpetrators, and Prince Asaka, for example, was shielded from prosecution after the war. This prince was granted immunity from all prosecution by General Douglas MacArthur, partly due to Hirohito's willingness to cooperate with the American occupation. Thus, despite being one of the commanders on the ground during the Nanjing Massacre, Prince Asaka, due to this imperial intervention, lived out a quiet life in the post-war era. Perhaps even worse, Japan's secret biological warfare program also operated with Hirohito's direct blessing. Unit 731, established in Manchuria, was a covert research unit that conducted lethal human experimentation. It was created in 1936 with Hirohito's personal authorization under the euphemistic cover of an epidemic prevention department. In the end, thousands of prisoners were tortured and killed in grotesque experiments. Hirohito received reports on Unit 731's activities and even ordered its expansion as the war progressed. He gave his consent to the unit's policies, effectively endorsing the use of biological and chemical weapons. After the war, American occupiers granted immunity to Unit 731's leaders in exchange for their data, a deal that kept Hirohito's connection hidden. Historical evidence indicates that Hirohito was neither a puppet nor a tyrant, but he was an involved leader who bore substantial responsibility. Early post-war portrayals of Hirohito cast him as a passive figurehead dominated by military advisors. In reality, later scholarship shows that Hirohito consulted regularly with his generals and ministers and was fully aware of Japan's battlefield situation, including reports of atrocities. There are clear instances of him exercising authority. In 1936, he personally intervened to suppress a coup attempt by rebellious army officers, demonstrating that he could assert control over the military when he chose. While this was before World War II broke out, this was well after a rogue element of the Japanese army invaded Manchuria in 1931. Additionally, in 1941, he approved the appointment of the hardline General Hideki Tojo as Prime Minister, solidifying the militant course of his government. Crucially, Hirohito did not object to policies that violated the laws of war. For example, he personally approved the Army's request to deploy poison gas in China against nationalist and communist forces. He also demonstrated awareness of the gravity of this as a war crime, since he refused to authorize the usage of chemical weapons against Western forces, fearing retaliation. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Allied powers had to decide whether the emperor should be held accountable for war crimes. Throughout the war, Allied propaganda often equated Hirohito with Hitler and Mussolini as criminal tyrants. Yet after Japan's surrender, Allied policy shifted dramatically and virtually immediately. Ultimately, the United States chose to shield Hirohito from prosecution. General Douglas MacArthur believed that putting Hirohito on trial would destabilize Japan and undermine the occupation. MacArthur saw Hirohito as a figure who could be co-opted against a rising tide of communist and left-wing ideology in Japan. Some Allied officials disagreed with this policy, and Australia, for instance, pushed for Hirohito's arrest, given the horrors suffered by captured Australian soldiers. Despite these complaints, the U.S. occupation authorities overruled such efforts. Instead, keeping Hirohito on the throne as a figurehead was deemed essential for maintaining order and implementing reforms. As a result, Hirohito wasn't charged at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, and MacArthur's staff suppressed evidence that might implicate the emperor or the imperial family. Instances such as Prince Asaka's command and orders at Nanjing would be conveniently swept under the rug. Japanese officials, for their part, destroyed many records to conceal the emperor's involvement in war crimes. The war crimes trials focused on other Japanese leaders, such as Prime Minister Tojo and generals of the Imperial Army, who were presented as the architects of Japan's aggression. At the Tokyo Tribunal, prosecutors and the defense alike treated the emperor as beyond reach. Due to this, the official narrative emerged that Japan's war crimes were the work of military extremists rather than the emperor. Some Allied prosecutors and judges privately noted the glaring omission of the emperor, pointing out that much responsibility for the war rested with him. Nevertheless, the decision to spare Hirohito went unchallenged. The official stance of the Americans on Hirohito did an extremely rapid 180. The American occupation authorities cultivated the image of Hirohito as a peace-loving monarch misled by his advisors. This post-war portrayal, reinforced by censorship and political expediency, shaped public understanding for decades. In Japan, Hirohito remained on the throne and was never officially blamed for the war. Generations grew up viewing him as a largely innocent, weak leader. In Japan, Hirohito's legacy is still debated. He remained a respected figure to many, yet his era is unavoidably tainted by the shadow of war crimes. Only much later, as more evidence came to light, did the narrative begin to shift to acknowledge his complicity. Given the destruction of records in the wake of the war, historians still don't know the full level of responsibility of the Japanese emperor in his country's brutal crimes. In the final chapters of World War II's North African campaign, a legend was born. According to this enduring tale, a hoard of gold and precious jewels, looted from Jewish communities in Tunisia, was spirited away by an SS unit operating behind Rommel's front. Over the decades, the mystery of Rommel's gold has captivated treasure hunters and historians alike, blurring the lines between fact and myth. The legend's foundation lies in very real events during the German occupation of Tunisia in 1943. As Rommel's once vaunted Afrika Korps was reeling from defeat at El Alamein and retreating west, SS Colonel Walter Rauff implemented brutal anti-Jewish measures in Tunisia. Rauff's men systematically plundered the wealth of the local Jewish population, seizing gold, jewelry, and other artifacts. In one documented case on the island of Djerba, they confiscated some 43 kilograms of gold from the Jewish community. Similar raids in Tunisian cities like Sfax, Gabes, Sousse, and Tunis amassed over 100 kilograms of gold from jewelers, bankers, and private homes. These valuables, along with silver and gems, were intended as war booty for the Third Reich's coffers. By early 1943, however, the Axis position in North Africa was collapsing under Allied advances. Rommel himself had been forced out of Libya, and in May 1943, the last German forces in Tunisia surrendered. Facing imminent defeat, the Germans needed to smuggle their ill-gotten treasure out of Tunisia before it could be captured. Evidence suggests that the confiscated hoard was transported north out of Africa as the Axis retreated. Historical accounts indicate that the SS unit under Walter Rauff evacuated the treasure by ship, moving it first to Italy or Corsica. In fact, American intelligence documents from the immediate post-war period hint that the gold stolen never reached Germany at all. Ralph himself was dispatched on a secret mission to Corsica in mid-1943, bringing along men who had served with him in Tunisia. Corsica, a mountainous French island in the Mediterranean, was then under Axis occupation, and an out-of-the-way spot to hide valuables in transit. What happened next would spark one of World War II's most enduring treasure legends. As the story goes, a group of SS officers on Corsica took 6 ammunition crates filled with gold, silver, and jewels and covertly sank them in the Mediterranean Sea. One version of the tale claims the officers deliberately scuttled the treasure-laden crates to retrieve later, preferring to hide the loot rather than let it fall into Allied hands. Another version holds that an attack by Allied bombers forced the Germans to dump the precious cargo overboard for safekeeping. Either way, all accounts agree that the crates of North African plunder, soon dubbed Rommel's treasure, never made it to their final destination. The treasure was lost beneath the waves, somewhere off Corsica, as the tide of war turned against the Axis. It's important to note that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself probably had little to nothing to do with this supposed treasure. The legend attaches his name to the gold, largely because it was plundered during the North African campaign he led, and perhaps because Rommel's own mystique adds allure to the story. In reality, the confiscation of Jewish gold in Tunisia was orchestrated by Ralph and the SS, and there is no evidence that Rommel was involved in this specific operation. Notably, German historian Klaus Michael Malmann noted that there's no record of Rommel ever coordinating with Ralph's group, and the two men likely never met. Nonetheless, the dramatic image of the famed Desert Fox and a cache of hidden gold proved irresistible. The first major spark that kept the legend alive after the war came from a former SS man with a story to tell. In June 1948, French authorities arrested a man trying to sneak into Corsica's restricted military zone. The suspect, an ex-SS trooper named Walter Kerner, confessed an astonishing tale. He claimed that around September 10, 1943, he had helped the SS sink 6 steel boxes filled with gold from Africa off Corsica's coast. Kerner even produced an old hand-drawn map purporting to show the location of the submerged crates. Taking his story seriously, the French government organized a dive expedition later that year and forced Kerner to help search the waters. The result was anticlimactic, and the divers found nothing whatsoever. Skepticism grew when a German journalist later discovered that Kerner couldn't have been in Corsica at the crucial time at all. In fact, hospital records placed him in the Soviet Union, wounded, at the exact time he claimed to have been in Corsica. In other words, Kerner's personal account was a lie, casting doubt on his claims. Yet intriguingly, this doesn't mean his account wasn't more generally true. Historians suspect Kerner may have obtained his information from someone else involved, since he seemed to know something of the treasure. He continued to insist on the treasure's existence, perhaps hoping to profit from it. In the following years, Kerner aggressively promoted the story, embellishing it with lurid details. He ended up boasting that he knew of the location of 4 tons of gold and other treasure, a great exaggeration beyond what was actually documented to have been looted. By the mid-20th century, the legend had grown beyond word of mouth into mainstream culture. The famed James Bond author Ian Fleming took interest in the treasure story. Fleming had learned through wartime intelligence files that a shipment of gold from Tunisia destined for Berlin had gone missing. This real-life mystery inspired him to weave Rommel's treasure into his fiction. It's directly mentioned in his famed novel, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, released in 1963. While novelists fantasized, real treasure hunters weren't far behind. The mystery surrounding those 6 lost chests off Corsica proved an irresistible lure for adventurers and opportunists. Throughout the 1960s and beyond, various expeditions set out in search of Rommel's gold. One high-profile attempt in 1963 was led by American millionaire Edwin Link and Lord John Kilbracken of Ireland, who mounted a sophisticated undersea search. Their quest, however, ran into an unexpected obstacle: the Corsican Mafia. According to accounts, the local crime syndicate sent them a menacing note declaring, quote, "The treasure belongs to us. Stay away from Corsica." Fearing trouble, the team reportedly backed off, though some believe the men may have been looking for an excuse to abandon the expedition. After all, should they actually turn up the ill-gotten booty, their ownership of it would have been hotly contested. In the 21st century, interest in Rommel's gold has persisted, spurred on by both serious researchers and popular media. In 2007, a group of German salvagers led by professional diver Klaus Kepler conducted a high-tech survey off Corsica using side-scan sonar and magnetometers. They combed the waters for unusual metal signatures that might indicate lost chests, but their search too came up blank. Around the same time, a British researcher and television scriptwriter, Terry Hodgkinson, announced he had pinpointed the treasure's likely resting place. After 15 years studying the mystery, Hodgkinson claimed to be confident he knew the exact location of the treasure. He proposed that it was just off the Corsican town of Bastia, a claim that appears to have come to nothing in the intervening years. He even secured permission from French authorities to hunt for the booty. Yet, despite the flurry of optimism throughout 2007, the fabled gold remained unfound. Terry Hodgkinson would later write a book on the treasure, pronouncing that he had solved the mystery, without actually producing any of the gold itself. What then is the historical consensus on Rommel's gold? The consensus is that the gold taken from Tunisia was real, and contemporary records and survivor testimonies confirm the thefts. However, that said, the treasure likely ended up at the bottom of the Mediterranean in 1943 and has remained there ever since. In the alternative, others propose that it was dumped off and picked up in the immediate post-war years. Those who favor this theory point to Walter Kerner, who definitely wasn't in North Africa, but knew the story well. Others speculate that French collaborators may have learned the location of the gold during or after the war. This has raised the possibility that former SS operatives or French officials engaged in a scramble to seize it in the chaos of the end of World War II. The question of whether Eva Braun was pregnant with Hitler's child at the end of the war is an obscure World War II mystery that began in 1945. The most direct source of the pregnancy claim came a few months after the war ended. Hans Bauer, Hitler's personal pilot, told his Soviet captors in December 1945 that Eva Braun had been pregnant in her final days. Bauer had been a member of Hitler's inner circle and was captured in Berlin. Under interrogation, he apparently asserted that the Führer's new wife was expecting. Notably, it's unclear how intensive this quote-unquote interrogation was, and at the very least, the threat of brutality was always present. This claim found its way into an extraordinary Soviet intelligence report compiled for Joseph Stalin, often called the Hitler Book. In that secret dossier, Soviet officers recorded that Hitler's pregnant wife, Eva Braun, took cyanide alongside him on April 30th. The inclusion of this detail suggests that Soviet investigators gave some credence to Bauer's statement, or similar witness statements from other Germans in captivity, at least initially. It's worth noting, however, that Bauer provided no proof beyond his word, and it's unclear on what basis he made the claim. Regardless, the Soviet report remained classified for decades, and at the time the Western public heard little of this pregnancy story. If she had been visibly pregnant or confided such news, one would expect at least some of those around her to have known. Yet no surviving member of Hitler's entourage ever confirmed a pregnancy beyond that one confession. Hans Bauer himself didn't publicly repeat the pregnancy claim after the war, at least not in his post-release memoirs. His 1950s memoir, I Was Hitler's Pilot, focuses on his experiences, but makes no mention of Eva carrying a child, which suggests even Bauer may have recognized the claim was unsubstantiated. It's possible that in the desperate atmosphere of captivity, he offered the Soviets a sensational tidbit, perhaps in an effort to have his interrogators lay off him. Modern historical consensus is clear that there is no credible evidence Eva Braun was ever pregnant by Adolf Hitler. Hitler's own last will and testament, dictated on April 29, 1945, makes no reference to any unborn child or provisions for offspring. If she had been pregnant, one might expect him to have mentioned a provision for this in the event that she didn't go along with his plans. Moreover, Hitler had long claimed to reject having a family of his own, preferring to present himself as symbolically married to Germany and the German people as a whole. It's also relevant that the couple's intimate life was highly discreet and remains very mysterious in and of itself. Historians have noted the lack of documentation about the exact nature of their relationship, and whether the two of them were ever physically intimate remains unknown. Further, much like a modern K-pop star, Hitler believed that he had to present himself as open and available to women to increase his appeal. Presenting himself as tied down to Eva Braun would have shattered this image, doubly so if she was openly pregnant with his child. It's important to note that during the Third Reich, Hitler and Eva Braun never appeared together as a couple, and her existence was only publicized following the war. Others have noted the idea that he would get his girlfriend pregnant out of wedlock would have been considered scandalous at the time. In other words, adding up all the evidence, there's simply nothing to indicate they were even trying for a child. Given this context, the claim that Braun suddenly became pregnant in the final months must be treated with extreme caution. At this point, the historical consensus is that the pregnancy is, in essence, a myth that arose under Soviet interrogation, or possibly even torture. On a summer day in 1947, two young men set out to explore the limestone hills near Clapham in the Yorkshire Dales. It was August 24th, and Jim Leach and his friend Harold Burgess were searching the slopes of Ingleborough for new caves to investigate. Hiking through an area of hollows and crags known as Clapham Bottoms, they noticed an inconspicuous depression on a ridge, partly choked with nettles and loose stones. The pair cleared some rocks and uncovered a narrow opening into the earth. Leach wriggled into the hidden cavity and descended about 10 feet down. In the dim light of the chamber, he spotted what looked like a pair of shoes sticking out from under a large boulder. As his eyes adjusted, he realized to his horror that the shoes were attached to human remains, an entire skeleton lying on the cave floor. Leach quickly called Burgess, and together they inspected the scene and, notably, found a small bottle with a white substance, which they believed to be flash powder. Stunned and shaken, they climbed out of the cave and hurried back to the village to alert the authorities. When the authorities arrived, they conducted a thorough search of the body and noted the man was carrying a key in his pocket, a point I'll come back to in a moment. A post-mortem examination of the remains was conducted on August 26, 1947. Although the body was mostly skeletal, the experts could determine a fair amount about the unknown individual. He was an adult male, approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall, and likely between 25 and 30 years old at the time of death. There were no obvious signs of traumatic injury, no broken bones or skull fractures, and no indication of long-term disease in the bones that were recovered. The forensic examiner estimated that death had occurred at least 2 years earlier and perhaps up to 6 years before the discovery. In other words, the man likely died sometime between 1941 and 1945, placing his death precisely during World War II. The small glass bottle discovered by the cavers turned out not to be flash powder after all, but something far more lethal. Tests identified the white contents as sodium cyanide. Cyanide is a fast-acting poison that was used in wartime espionage by agents working in enemy nations. Finding it in a hidden cave with a body of an individual who perished during World War II immediately raised eyebrows. An official coroner's inquest was convened on November 25, 1947. Despite a review of all the evidence, as well as a review of all local missing people in the area, no one could be matched up to this body. Notably, while the cyanide was theorized to be the cause of the man's death, the coroner was unable to say this with absolute certainty. Given the forensic technology at the time and the advanced state of decomposition, sufficient evidence for analysis couldn't be gathered. From the moment the cyanide bottle turned up, one theory took hold of the public imagination. Was the skeleton from a World War II spy? The presence of a poison strongly suggested that this man might have carried it as a contingency to avoid capture. There are some historical facts that lend plausibility to the spy theory. During the war, especially in 1940 to 1941, Germany did send clandestine agents into Britain, often by parachute drop into rural areas. A number of these agents were captured quickly by British forces, often with the help of alert local citizens. A spy parachuting into the English countryside might very well carry a standard-issue cyanide kit in case his mission went sideways. That said, no concrete evidence has ever emerged to confirm the espionage theory. After the war, captured German records and interrogations of agents didn't turn up any obvious candidate for an agent dying in the region. No missing radio or code book was found in the cave, though some have questioned whether that key in his pocket might have unlocked a stash hidden elsewhere containing these items. British and German intelligence archives show no unidentified agents unaccounted for in that region. In short, official sources haven't corroborated the idea that the individual was a spy. Notably, modern forensic techniques may be able to solve this mystery once and for all and determine if the skeleton belonged to an Axis spy or someone else entirely. DNA extraction from dense bones or teeth could provide a complete genetic profile. With that, forensic genealogists could use DNA databases to match the man to distant relatives and reconstruct family trees, a method that solved many decades-old mysteries. Further, isotopic analysis of the bones and teeth would reveal where the man likely grew up, what kind of diet he had, and whether he moved between regions, helping narrow down his origins. If he wasn't local to the UK, this technique would reveal it, and could even reveal the specific part of Germany he grew up in, if he was a spy. Modern chemical analysis could potentially detect trace cyanide in the bones, something 1940s investigators couldn't conclusively do. This would allow investigators to confirm that he actually perished from cyanide poisoning. Even the clothing and items found with him could be re-examined. Tools like mass spectrometry could identify fibers, dyes, and residues, pointing to where his clothing came from or what substances he may have handled. If the authorities kept these remains somewhere, we may still find out whether this man was an Axis agent or not, despite the significant passage of time. Germany's pursuit of atomic science during World War II was a fragmented effort, vastly smaller in scale than the Allied Manhattan Project. Yet, for decades, rumors have persisted that in the desperate final months of the war, a small nuclear device might have been tested on German soil. Two leading figures emerged in Germany's atomic program, one of whom is perhaps amongst the most famed scientists ever. Werner Heisenberg, the renowned physicist, headed the theoretical research, while Kurt Diebner, an ambitious physicist, oversaw experimental work largely based upon Heisenberg's findings. They and others explored nuclear reactors, uranium isotope separation, and the possibility of explosive chain reactions. By late 1944, Germany hadn't achieved a sustained nuclear chain reaction, nor produced sufficient enriched nuclear material for a bomb. The program had suffered from resource shortages, Allied bombing, and strategic missteps. A special Allied task force accompanying U.S. troops in 1944 concluded that the Germans weren't even close to making an atomic weapon. In April 1945, American forces overran key German atomic sites, including Hagerloch, where Heisenberg's team had a half-built reactor, and captured top scientists. These scientists, including Heisenberg, Diebner, and others, were secretly recorded during their detention at Farm Hall in England. While at Farm Hall, they expressed shock upon learning of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and none ever hinted that Germany had already tested any such device. This mainstream historical record has led most experts to conclude that Germany never succeeded in testing a rudimentary atomic bomb by war's end, but an alternative narrative exists. One focal point of these claims is Jonastal in Thuringia, central Germany. This is the site of an unfinished underground complex built under extreme secrecy from 1944 to 1945 under the direction of the SS, rather than Germany's nuclear science program. The exact purpose of this facility remains uncertain. Some have speculated it was possibly a last-ditch headquarters, a weapons research site, or a production center for Wunderwaffen. Notably, the general who was in charge of the site had previously been in charge of other advanced weaponry projects. The project was never completed and was abandoned as the Third Reich collapsed in spring 1945. American troops captured the area in early April 1945, only to later hand it to the Soviets, who cordoned it off as a restricted zone after the war. It's against this backdrop and the chaos of the war's end that the alleged atomic test at Jonastal arises. According to several accounts, an experimental nuclear device was detonated in the Jonastal area in March 1945. The most commonly cited incident took place on the night of March 4, 1945, at the Ohrdruf military training ground adjacent to Jonastal. A local witness, Clara Werner, who lived in the area, later described seeing a giant blinding flash of light with an eerie coloration. She noted that a shock wave or powerful wind followed, and afterward local residents experienced unexplained illnesses in the days following the blast. Another witness, a worker named Heinz Wachsmuth, claimed that the next day he was ordered by officers to help cremate a large number of bodies at the site. He noted that the bodies of these people were badly burnt and also completely hairless. He also recalled overhearing officers hinting that a new kind of weapon had been tested and that they said it was something the whole world would talk about. That said, he admitted that he never heard any mention of words associated with atomic weaponry. Proponents of the Jonastal atomic test hypothesis point to several pieces of evidence and testimonies suggesting that Germany managed at least a rudimentary nuclear blast in 1945. A March 1945 Soviet spy report, purportedly based on a, quote, reliable source, informed Moscow that the Germans had detonated 2 large explosions in Thuringia. According to this report, there was a highly radioactive effect from this explosion, and uranium was suspected to be involved. One of the recipients of this report was Joseph Stalin himself, indicating the Soviets took the claim seriously at the time. The Soviet report even warned that the new German weapon might slow down the Red Army's offensive. That said, it was well known that Germany was attempting to weaponize nuclear power, and the source the Soviet report relied upon has been lost to time. Notably, German historian Rainer Karlsch has investigated the claims of German atomic research significantly. As part of his investigation, Karlsch commissioned soil analyses from the purported test site. He claimed that soil samples showed unnatural radioactive isotopes, notably cesium-137 and cobalt-60, that don't occur in nature and could indicate the residues of a nuclear explosion. Karlsch argued that these findings, combined with the absence of typical industrial sources in that remote area, pointed to a nuclear detonation in 1945. All that said, most historians of science and other mainstream experts remain unconvinced that Germany actually conducted a successful atomic test at Jonastal. They offer several powerful counterarguments, backed by evidence, to refute or at least question the claims of an atomic blast. According to these experts, a fundamental problem is that Germany simply didn't possess the necessary quantity of enriched nuclear material by March 1945 to fuel a true atomic bomb. A fission explosion requires either highly enriched uranium or plutonium in significant amounts. All experts, including Rainer Karlsch himself, acknowledge the Germans never produced that much weapons-grade material. Thus, any device tested couldn't have been a classical atomic bomb as one would imagine. At best, it might have been a dirty bomb, which is a conventional bomb that spreads radioactive material, or a very low-yield partial fission device. Skeptics argue that such a bomb would be more of a fizzle than a true nuclear blast, and it's unclear such a device would release enough radiation to match the witnesses' descriptions. Despite extensive post-war investigations, no German documents have surfaced that confirm an atomic test. The regime was meticulous in record-keeping, yet there are no orders, logs, or reports referencing a special test in Thuringia involving a nuclear device. Further, Allied intelligence found no mention of a German nuclear test when they swept through Germany. The only mention of it whatsoever comes from Soviet intelligence, and some speculate that these reports may have been fabricated. If this is the case, the hypothesis is that this was done to justify seizing as many German nuclear scientists as possible in advance of the inevitable showdown with the West. For their part, Allied teams interrogated scientists and seized laboratories in April and May 1945, specifically looking for nuclear developments. Despite these interrogations and significant search efforts, no evidence of any test was ever found. The principal German nuclear scientists appear to have known nothing of any test. The farm hall transcripts from August 1945 capture Heisenberg and other world-class scientists in candid conversation when they thought no one was listening. They expressed astonishment at the news of the bomb and tried to figure out how it was made. Notably, it's been hypothesized they may have believed they were being recorded and explicitly didn't discuss the matter further to maintain leverage. After all, it would only make sense to record everything that enemy nuclear physicists were saying right after Hiroshima, and surely men as smart as Werner Heisenberg understood that. Still others have speculated that the test could have occurred, and they may legitimately have known nothing about it. The Jonastal facility wasn't under the control of Germany's nuclear program, but rather had been under the direct command of the SS. In the waning days of the war, it's possible that some weapons-grade nuclear material may have ended up being transported there. Those responsible for the test, not being from the main nuclear program, may have confused a dirty bomb with a legitimate atomic weapon. According to experts, the most decisive refutation comes from physical evidence, or the lack thereof. In 2006, a leading scientific institute in Germany conducted comprehensive soil tests at the alleged test site. These high-precision analyses found no abnormal radioactivity in the ground that could indicate a nuclear blast, after accounting for normal fallout from events like Chernobyl. If a nuclear detonation had happened, it should have left long-lived isotopic signatures in the soil, but none have been found by independent peer-reviewed checks. Rainer Karlsch's sample findings are explained by experts as likely being due to other sources such as contamination from decades of Soviet military activity in that area. That said, even the mainstream experts have acknowledged that the findings at Jonastal are unusual, even if they don't believe they indicate a conventional atomic blast. The alleged German atomic test in March 1945 remains a fascinating mystery at the fringes of World War II history. For now, until further evidence comes out, this test is generally regarded as an event that requires much more research and examination. In the winter of 1937, as the Imperial Japanese Army carved its way toward the Chinese capital of Nanjing, the Japanese public followed the campaign with total attention. On the home front, newspapers were filled with stories of imperial glory and military triumph, a narrative carefully curated by state censors to bolster morale and justify the war. But amidst the standard reports of battles won and territory seized, a different kind of story emerged. This narrative read less like a war dispatch and more like a sports update. It was designed to be thrilling and featured the almost unbelievable tale of a contest between two young officers. The goal wasn't to capture a bridge or secure a town. It was to see who could be the first to slay 100 men with a katana. The so-called athletes in this gruesome race were Second Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda. The press painted them as paragons of the Japanese martial spirit. Mukai, 26, was an expert in bayonet fighting, wielding his prized blade, the Seki no Magoroku. Noda, 25, carried a treasured ancestral sword. They were presented not as anonymous cogs in the war machine, but as relatable heroes, their friendly rivalry a source of national pride. Their banter, as reported by the Tokyo Nichi Nichi Shinbun, was lighthearted and competitive, further cementing the sports-like atmosphere. For 2 weeks, the paper serialized the contest, publishing running tallies like a morbid box score. The story reached its sensational climax on December 13, 1937, the very day Japanese forces officially captured Nanjing. The headline was triumphant, and declared that the final score was Mukai 106 to Noda's 105. Both men were said to have, quote, gone extra innings in their quest to win this morbid contest. Because both men had supposedly surpassed the century mark and couldn't determine a clear winner, they reportedly agreed to a new goal of 150 slayings. But was it all true? Or was this tale of a 100-man killing contest a carefully constructed piece of propaganda designed to mask a far more horrifying reality? The answer lies buried in the blood-soaked landscape between Shanghai and Nanjing, and in the decades-long battle over history that followed. The heroic narrative of the contest, as presented to the Japanese public, existed in a vacuum, deliberately scrubbed of its horrific context. The reality of the Imperial Japanese Army's advance from Shanghai to Nanjing in late 1937 was not a clean series of honorable duels. It was a 170-mile corridor of terror that historians have called a zone of total destruction. The actions of Mukai and Noda, far from being an exceptional feat of arms, were a symptom of a systemic culture of brutality that had taken root within the Japanese military. This culture was fostered by a confluence of factors. Logistically, the army was often poorly supplied, leading to an implicit policy of living off the land. While this was officially just kept to looting, it quickly devolved into a system of committing disgusting acts against the Chinese civilian population. Ideologically, a distorted interpretation of Bushido glorified death and instilled a profound contempt for surrender. Japanese soldiers were taught that being captured was the ultimate dishonor, which in turn fostered a brutal disregard for enemy soldiers who laid down their arms. This was compounded by a legal vacuum. Japan had signed but pointedly not ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. This effectively left Chinese captives without any legal protection. To make matters even worse, this institutional mindset was underpinned by a pervasive dehumanizing of the Chinese population. Official military training manuals even suggested that new soldiers should get the opportunity to execute captive combatants. The march to Nanjing became a grim foreshadowing of the massacre to come. Eyewitness accounts and soldiers' own diaries describe acts such as massacring the populations of entire villages simply as something to do to pass the time. Now, given the platform we're on, I can't even fully go into the details of what these Japanese soldiers did during these massacres. What I can say, though, is that you should imagine the worst things possible, double the cruelty and violence, and then you'll potentially be somewhat close. This was the world in which this contest took place. It wasn't an aberration, but rather, it was a publicly celebrated instance of the Army's standard operating procedure. The propaganda machine didn't invent the extreme levels of violence. It merely selected one small part of it, stripped it of the horrors against women and children, and repackaged it as a heroic game for the home front. To understand the historical debate, one must return to the original articles themselves. The story was not a single report, but a serialized narrative, a piece of wartime theater that unfolded over 4 key installments. It was featured in the Tokyo Nichi Nichi Shinbun and its sister paper, the Osaka Mainichi Shinbun, between November 30th and December 13th, 1937. The progression was designed to build suspense and keep the public engaged, transforming mass carnage into a weekly cliffhanger. The journalistic style was vivid and personal. The first article on November 30th set the stage, introducing the two quote-unquote competitors, their prize swords, and the initial scores. The reports also made it very clear that these two men were engaging in non-stop, brutal hand-to-hand combat, which is important to keep in mind. After all, the reality of the contest would turn out to be so much darker. Subsequent reports updated the tallies, showing the race tightening as the army closed in on Nanjing. The final article on December 13th provided the dramatic conclusion, with both men surpassing the goal and cheerfully agreeing to extend their competition. The reports included details such as how traditional Japanese steelworking techniques were so superior that the blades were completely undamaged through all the carnage. Almost immediately after the story was rediscovered in the post-war era, its factuality came under question. Historians and even Japanese veterans noted the sheer improbability of the feat as described. Fighting over 100 men in fierce hand-to-hand combat would likely exhaust any soldier and render a katana blunted and useless. Notably, this blunt sword theory became a central pillar of the revisionist argument that the story was a complete fabrication. However, this line of argument focuses on a deliberate misdirection. The key to understanding what likely happened comes from Tsuyoshi Noda himself. After returning to Japan, he reportedly gave a speech in his hometown, where he made a crucial admission. He confessed that the tales of heroic combat were an exaggeration for the papers, saying that he had only slain 4 men in hand-to-hand combat. In reality, he told them the two men would offer the Chinese soldiers safety if they surrendered. The soldiers would then bind the men's hands, as if taking them prisoner. Then, the two men who were participating in the contest would engage in acts of simple, cowardly slaughter against the bound men, keeping a rough tally as they went. Thus it's clear that the revisionists attacked the propaganda lie, the heroic duels, in order to cast doubt on the historical truth of the crimes committed by the men. As Allied investigators prepared for the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, they sifted through mountains of Japanese documents. It was there that they found the newspaper articles from the Tokyo Nichi Nichi Shinbun. What had been a source of domestic pride was now seen as a sick crime perpetrated against the Chinese populace. In 1947, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda were arrested by American forces and detained in Tokyo's Sugamo prison. They were soon extradited to China to stand trial before the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal, a body established by the nationalist government to bring Japanese criminals to justice. In the dock, they were joined by Captain Gunkichi Tanaka, an officer accused of personally slaughtering over 300 Chinese civilians at Nanjing with his swords. The trial was not, as some later claimed, based solely on the sensationalized newspaper reports. The men were charged with atrocities committed during the Battle of Nanjing and the subsequent massacre. The newspaper articles served as the crucial link that identified Mukai and Noda and placed them at the scene. In a profound historical irony, the very propaganda designed to bring them fame and glory became the instrument of their downfall. Without those celebratory articles, they might have vanished into the anonymity of the post-war world, two of the countless soldiers who committed atrocities and were never held to account. On December 18, 1947, all three men were found guilty. On January 28, 1948, Mukai and Noda, both 35 years old, faced a firing squad in the mountains outside Nanjing, the city where they had sought their disturbing glory. In the end, the historical consensus on the contest is one of profound and disturbing nuance. The event, as it was reported in 1937, a heroic sporting competition of hand-to-hand combat between two evenly matched warriors, was complete fiction. It was a piece of propaganda, skillfully crafted to dehumanize the enemy, promote Japanese supremacy, and transform a campaign into an exciting spectacle for the home front. Today, it's widely accepted that the core of the story did happen, and that the numbers reported likely weren't significant exaggerations. The true fabrication surrounding this twisted contest was to turn two cowardly criminals who were executing bound men into superhuman modern-day samurai warriors. On the eve of World War II, Glenn Miller had become one of the most famous and successful entertainers in America. His unique big band sound propelled swing hits like In the Mood and Moonlight Serenade to the top of the charts. Miller's orchestra became synonymous with the golden age of swing music, and he was the nation's best-selling recording artist from 1939 to 1942. Miller's climb to stardom hadn't come easy. In the mid-1930s, he struggled and even had to disband an early version of his band due to lackluster success. Determined to find a distinctive style, he tweaked his arrangements until he hit upon the signature sound that set him apart. By 1939, the revitalized Glenn Miller Orchestra was drawing huge crowds and churning out one-hit record after another. In 1942, with America now at war, Miller stunned the entertainment world by trading his civilian fame for an Army uniform. At 38, he was above draft age, but he volunteered for the U.S. Army Air Forces, keen to support the troops with his music. Notably, he gave up the modern equivalent of almost $20 million per year to serve his country. Commissioned as an officer, he formed a large military band, the Army Air Force's orchestra, bringing his big band style to military bases across the states. He truly believed his catchy tunes could boost soldiers' morale as much as any pep talk. The effort was a massive success. His orchestra toured training camps playing both marches and swing, and he became known as the musical heartbeat of the Allied war effort. For the first 2 years in the military, Miller was stateside. However, in mid-1944, Miller took his band overseas to England, arriving shortly after the D-Day invasion. London was still under bombardment, so the group set up operations in a safer location north of the city and began performing for Allied forces. They played live concerts at airfields for thousands of servicemen and broadcast regular radio programs over the BBC and military networks. Troops and civilians alike tuned in to hear Miller's swinging renditions of favorite songs. By that autumn, Major Glenn Miller's band had become a crucial part of the Allied war effort. Notably, they even recorded special programs for a German audience to undermine enemy morale with the allure of his fresh, popular American sound. As Allied armies liberated France in late 1944, Miller was eager to bring his music to newly freed Paris. His superiors agreed that moving the band to the continent would further uplift the troops. To prepare, Miller and his musicians recorded many hours of shows in advance to cover their absence from British radio. By December 1944, plans were set for the band's move. Miller was slated to fly ahead to Paris to arrange venues for his orchestra and to be ready for a big Christmas concert for the soldiers. On December 15, 1944, Miller set off on that journey to Paris, a trip from which he would never return. Bad winter weather had interrupted air travel, canceling the official transport he was supposed to take. Determined to get to Paris in time, Miller hitched a ride on a small army plane that his friend Norman Bazell had arranged. Shortly before 2 p.m., Miller, Bazell, and pilot flight officer John Morgan took off in a single-engine UC-64 Norseman from an airfield in southern England. They flew out in cold, foggy conditions, staying low under the clouds. Miller, known to be a bit nervous about flying, reportedly even joked with the ground crew about needing a parachute before takeoff. But once that plane disappeared into the December mist, it was never seen again, unless the story of one British airman is to be believed. It took days for any degree of clarity to emerge. When Miller's band members arrived in Paris on a separate flight and their leader wasn't there to meet them, alarm bells rang. Military officials initially had no record of Miller's flight since it wasn't an authorized transport, causing confusion. By December 23rd, the Army Air Forces realized Miller's plane was missing, and on Christmas Eve, the shocking news was released. Major Glenn Miller was presumed lost over the English Channel. The announcement stunned the public and the military alike. The man behind America's wartime soundtrack had vanished without a trace. In the wake of Miller's disappearance, the U.S. military launched an investigation. By early January 1945, an official report concluded that the most likely cause was a tragic accident. The theory was that a combination of bad weather and mechanical failure brought the plane down. The Norseman's engine was prone to icing in freezing fog, which could have cut out the engine mid-flight. At the same time, the pilot was flying blind in dense cloud cover. If the engine failed or the aircraft iced up, they would have had virtually no chance to recover. In short, the Army found no evidence of enemy action or foul play, and that it appeared that Miller's plane simply succumbed to the elements and went into the sea. Still, the lack of definitive proof left room for other theories. The most famous alternative explanation is the friendly fire theory. Decades later, a British RAF veteran named Fred Shaw claimed that on December 15, 1944, he saw a small plane plunge into the channel after bombs were jettisoned by Allied bombers. According to Shaw, his bomber squadron had aborted a mission and dropped their unused bombs over the water. He claimed he witnessed a single-engine aircraft get caught in a blast and fall into the sea. This story led to speculation that Miller's Norseman might have been the plane accidentally knocked out of the sky by bombs dropped from above. However, many experts remained skeptical. The visibility was poor that afternoon, and it would have been very difficult for Shaw to clearly spot a plane from thousands of feet up. Moreover, no official records from the time indicate that Miller's plane was near the path of the bomber fleet. To this day, the friendly fire theory remains unconfirmed, an intriguing possibility but not backed by hard evidence. Other, more sensational rumors have also popped up over the years. Some have alleged that Miller wasn't on the plane at all and instead died in Paris under scandalous circumstances, or that he never left England and died of a health issue that was hushed up. The Paris story suggests that he may have been slain by a French woman who was running a honeypot operation for the Germans. Under this theory, the Germans were eager to score a major morale victory by taking out Miller. This theory fails to account for the whereabouts of the other crewmen, and is generally dismissed as nothing more than a rumor. The scene is a mass rally in Pyongyang on October 14, 1945. The city is electric with a mix of relief and uncertainty. After 35 years of brutal Japanese colonial rule, Korea is free, but its fate is being decided by foreign powers. In the north, the Soviet Red Army are the liberators, and they've gathered the people to present a hero. He's introduced as the legendary guerrilla commander, General Kim Il-sung, a name whispered in awe for his daring exploits against the Japanese occupiers. The crowd waits, expecting to see a seasoned, perhaps grizzled, veteran warrior. Instead, a boyish man in his early 30s, wearing the crisp uniform of a Soviet Red Army captain, steps to the microphone. A murmur of confusion and disappointment ripples through the crowd. This wasn't the larger-than-life general they had imagined. That moment of public bewilderment is the seed of the entire mystery surrounding the man who would eventually become North Korea's eternal president. The man before the crowd wasn't a demigod of legend, but an ambitious and politically astute guerrilla named Kim Song-ju, who had been carefully selected by his Soviet patrons. His entire subsequent rule, and the very foundation of the North Korean state, would be predicated on closing the gap between the man he was and the myth he needed to become. To understand the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, one must first understand the two parallel lives of its founder. There's the hagiography constructed by the state for their founding hero, and the far more complex reality pieced together by historians. We'll first explore the official, state-sanctioned legend taught to every North Korean from birth. Then we'll contrast it with the historical consensus and examine the persistent imposter theory as a symptom of this foundational deception. In North Korea, the story of Kim Il-sung doesn't begin with his birth, but rather it begins with his ancestors. The official story portrays his family as a long line of preordained patriotic revolutionaries, establishing what is known as the Mount Paktu bloodline. His great-grandfather is credited with leading the attack on the American merchant ship General Sherman in 1866. His father, Kim Hyung-jik, wasn't merely an activist, but a pioneer of Marxism who led the anti-Japanese independence movement. His mother, Kang Pan-sok, on the other hand, is venerated as the mother of the Korean nation, who embodied all that is virtuous about the Korean people. She's portrayed perhaps not entirely as a human entity, but as a vessel that was created through the collective will of the Korean people to give birth to their great liberator. This narrative frames the Kim family not as participants in the liberation struggle, but as its very heart and soul destined to lead the nation. From this hallowed lineage, according to the official sources, the young Kim emerged as a revolutionary prodigy. Official anecdotes, taught to school children as historical fact, describe him vowing to defeat the Japanese imperialists at the tender age of 5 while sitting on his mother's knee. Other stories suggest that as a child, he lectured adults on Marxist principles, not due to anything that he had learned, but almost as if he was divinely ordained. Naturally, according to these official stories, these adults were shocked, baffled, and instantly converted to the cause. At just 14, he supposedly founded the movement that would eventually overthrow Japanese rule, a seminal moment in the nation's revolutionary history. His childhood is depicted as a series of heroic acts of resistance, from defacing Japanese textbooks to organizing his fellow students into acts of revolutionary mischief. The centerpiece of the legend is his role as the singular, brilliant commander of the entire Korean resistance against Japan. The official narrative places him at a secret guerrilla base on the slopes of the sacred Mount Paktu, the mythical birthplace of Dangun, the founder of the First Korean Kingdom. This location is no accident, and it deliberately fuses Kim's revolutionary struggle with Korea's deepest national myths. From this sacred ground, he is said to have single-handedly organized and led the Korean People's Revolutionary Army, from which he liberated the Korean people from Japan. In this telling, all other anti-Japanese resistance figures, many of whom were his superiors in reality, are either erased from history or demoted to the status of his loyal followers. Crucially, his son and heir, Kim Jong-il, is said to have been born in a humble log cabin at the Mount Paktu secret camp in 1942. This nativity was supposedly marked by divine omens, including a double rainbow appearing in the sky and a new star shining brightly in the heavens. When historians peel back the layers of propaganda, a starkly different picture emerges. The man who would rule North Korea for nearly half a century was born Kim Song-ju on April 15, 1912, in a village near Pyongyang. His family was not a lineage of revolutionaries, but was, ironically, part of Korea's small but influential Protestant community. His grandfather was a Protestant minister, and his father was even named after St. Peter. Like many Koreans resentful of Japanese rule, his family fled to Manchuria around 1920, seeking refuge and opportunity. It was in Manchuria, not Korea, that Kim Song-ju received his revolutionary education. He attended Chinese schools, and according to some who knew him later, he may have preferred to communicate in Chinese rather than Korean. As a teenager, he was drawn into the world of underground Chinese communist youth organizations and was briefly jailed for his activities. His path wasn't a uniquely Korean one, and it was forged within the broader, communist-led anti-Japanese struggle in Manchuria. He joined a Chinese-led guerrilla force and proved to be a legitimately capable and courageous fighter, eventually rising to become a division commander by his mid-20s. It was during this period, around 1935, that he adopted the name Kim Il-sung, a name already famous and associated with an earlier, legendary anti-Japanese hero. While he was one of the more effective Korean commanders in the region, historians believe he was a mid-level officer in a Chinese-led army, taking orders from Chinese superiors. He wasn't the supreme commander of a unified Korean force by any means. The historical record shows that by late 1940, the elite Japanese Kwantung Army had effectively crushed the guerrilla resistance in Manchuria. Kim and the remnants of his unit were forced to flee across the border into the Soviet Union. He spent the remainder of the conflict, from late 1940 until Japan's surrender in 1945, in a Soviet military camp near Khabarovsk. There he was commissioned as a captain in the Soviet Red Army's 88th Rifle Brigade, a special unit composed of exiled Chinese and Korean fighters. It was here, in a Soviet camp in 1941, that his son was born. The child, who would later be known as Kim Jong-il, wasn't given a revolutionary Korean name, but a Russian one, Yuri Kim. The chasm between the man and the myth gave rise to a persistent and sensational rumor, which has come to be termed the imposter theory. This theory claims that the man who returned to Pyongyang in 1945 wasn't the guerrilla fighter Kim Il-sung at all, but a fraud named Kim Song-ju. Under this theory, he had stolen the identity of a much older, more famous, and genuinely legendary anti-Japanese hero who had perished in battle. This idea flourished in the chaotic post-war environment, fueled by Korean confusion at the 1945 rally and by early Western intelligence reports. There's even a now declassified CIA dossier that treated the claim as credible, suspecting the Soviets inserted their agent into the Korean fray. Despite its durability as a piece of Cold War propaganda, the academic consensus has thoroughly debunked the literal imposter theory. The evidence against it is definitive, and witnesses who knew Kim Song-ju both before and after his time in the Soviet Union confirmed he was the same person. Japanese Kwantung Army records from the 1930s specifically identify the young guerrilla commander, using the alias Kim Il-sung, as a significant and wanted resistance figure. Most conclusively, his personal file has been found in Russian archives, confirming his identity and career path from Manchurian guerrilla to Soviet Red Army captain. However, the real significance of the imposter theory isn't its factual accuracy, but what its existence reveals. In a political sense, the man presented in 1945 was an imposter. The Soviets were presenting a 33-year-old captain as the legendary general the people expected to see. However, the real legendary general who first went by the name Kim Il-sung was Kim Kung-chan, and he was in his 60s when he fell in combat in 1942. By 1945, Kim Il-sung had already been using that same name for over a decade. Essentially, the imposter theory is an urban legend born from a kernel of truth. Kim Il-sung did take the name of someone much more famous in the resistance movement, but he actively used this name long before he was the front runner to lead a communist Korea. It's a distorted echo of the population's legitimate confusion and the regime's foundational act of political misdirection. The theory is a ghost born from the fog of a propaganda campaign, a symptom of a much deeper deception about who Kim Il-sung truly was and where his authority came from. When Kim returned to Korea in 1945, he was a political unknown. He had no independent power base and faced numerous, more prominent rivals from domestic communist and nationalist factions. His sole claim to power was the backing of a foreign occupying army, the Soviet Union, which saw him as a pliable asset who spoke Russian. To survive and consolidate power, he needed more than Soviet tanks. He needed a compelling narrative of his exploits. The creation of the Kim Il-sung myth was a calculated and essential political project. It recast him from a legitimate combatant against the Japanese to the sole liberator of the nation, providing him with the heroic, nationalist legitimacy he desperately lacked. By establishing himself as the singular leader of the revolution, he could brand all rivals as traitors or factionalists, justifying their ruthless purges in the 1950s. Most importantly, by linking his family to the sacred Mount Paktu and the mythical origins of the Koreans, he laid the ideological groundwork for a hereditary succession. This, of course, is a concept entirely alien to Marxism, but this myth transformed him from a communist premier like any other into a dynastic founder whose family still rules North Korea. In the ruins of Berlin in May 1945, as the war in Europe reached its violent end, one of the Reich's most feared henchmen simply vanished. The man was Heinrich Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, which had functioned as Germany's secret state police. Amid this chaos, Müller was last seen in the command bunker with high-level leaders on the evening of May 1st, 1945. He was calm but determined, reportedly declaring, "I have no intention of being taken prisoner by the Russians." Then, like a ghost, Heinrich Müller simply disappeared, and no confirmed trace of him has ever been found. To this day, he remains the highest level official of the Third Reich who has never been found. Heinrich Müller was not a household name during the Third Reich era, at least not to the general public, but within the corridors of the police state he was both respected and feared. Born in 1900 and hardened by service as a combat pilot in World War I, Müller joined the Munich police after that war. He earned a reputation as an aggressive investigator, especially against communists, unconstrained by legal norms or mercy. This caught the attention of party leaders, including Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, architects of the Third Reich's internal security apparatus. By 1939, he had become the chief of the Gestapo, answering directly to Heydrich and later Himmler. As Gestapo chief, Müller was deeply involved in the darkest crimes of the Third Reich and was a key organizer of political repression and terror. From his desk, this cold bureaucrat directed the persecution of anyone deemed an enemy of the state. But this video isn't the history of the Gestapo, so let's jump ahead to 1945. The Allies began rounding up surviving leaders of the Reich, and the search for Heinrich Müller commenced almost immediately. But from the start, investigators found only frustration. In the summer of 1945, Allied war crimes teams scoured Berlin for clues to Müller's fate. They questioned former colleagues and combed through charred records. A few leads emerged, with some eyewitnesses claiming that he had been seen fleeing the bunker. To complicate matters, Heinrich Müller was a painfully common name in Germany. Tracking sightings of a middle-aged, nondescript man named Heinrich Müller is the equivalent to issuing an alert to be on the lookout for John Smith. Numerous men shared the name, and some even matched the former chief's general description. Through the late 1940s, American and British intelligence agencies continued to pursue any hint of Müller. They searched the home of his former mistress in 1947 and monitored mail and communications, hoping the fugitive might contact his loved ones. But there was only silence, and by the end of the decade, as the Cold War set in, priorities shifted. Hunting down former Third Reich officials was no longer the top mission, as the West came into rapid conflict with the Eastern Bloc. As years passed, Heinrich Müller's fate became the subject of myriad theories, some plausible, others bordering on fantastical. During the Cold War, both the Western and Eastern blocs found it useful to stoke rumors about the missing Gestapo chief. In the 1950s, whispers circulated that Müller might have been taken by the Soviet Union. It wasn't an absurd idea. The NKVD, Soviet intelligence, had captured numerous officials and scientists. Some speculated that his techniques on internal repression were of interest to Stalin, and that he may have been brought in to train secret police in the Soviet Union. Even Walter Schellenberg, a former high-ranking intelligence officer, wrote in his memoir that Müller had supposedly defected to the USSR in 1945 and was later seen in Moscow. No concrete evidence ever emerged for this, but the mere notion was chilling. This man, who was responsible for immense suffering, may still be up to his old tricks. The flip side of this rumor appeared in propaganda as well. Soviet and East German sources occasionally hinted that Müller had actually escaped to the West. In the disinformation tug of war, Each side implied the other might be sheltering this notorious war criminal. The dramatic capture of Eichmann in 1960, Müller's subordinate in the Gestapo, reignited hope that Müller could also be found. If Eichmann could hide in Argentina for 15 years and then be caught, perhaps Müller was out there too. During interrogation, Eichmann himself reportedly said he believed his old boss was still alive, but either couldn't or wouldn't provide any further details. This tantalizing hint spurred new investigations in West Germany. Authorities put Müller's remaining family and former associates under surveillance for any sign of contact, but again, nothing definitive surfaced. For a long time, the dominant theory, by process of elimination, was that Heinrich Müller most likely died during the fall of Berlin in 1945. It seemed a reasonable conclusion. Many high-ranking German officials chose death over capture, and Müller had explicitly said he would do so. A high-level Polish defector claimed, in 1961, that the Soviets had taken him to Moscow, not as a prisoner, but as an asset. According to this theory, some have speculated that after the death of Stalin, he was silently eliminated. In 2001, the CIA file on Heinrich Müller was released, which proved, if the records are to be believed, that the CIA itself was never in contact with Müller after the war. Notably, in 1967, a man in Panama bore such a strong resemblance to Heinrich Müller that Müller's wife identified him as the former Gestapo chief. After fingerprint analyses were conducted, the man, who was facing extradition to West Germany, was released. He was definitively not Heinrich Müller, despite his appearance. And if you're one of those people who just listens, I've put a photograph of Müller up beside this Panamanian man. Personally, I find the resemblance between the two men disturbingly similar, but it looks as though this man simply had the misfortune of being born the doppelganger to Müller. On the morning of November 23, 1944, British anti-aircraft troops near Kortenberg in Belgium were startled to see a lone B-17 Flying Fortress bomber appearing out of the gray sky. It was heading straight toward them with its landing gear down, causing some concern amongst the British soldiers present. No flights were scheduled, so the soldiers on the ground assumed this heavy American aircraft must be in distress and attempting an emergency landing. The massive four-engine bomber came in fast and low, overshooting their position and plowing into a nearby field. Its landing was rough and uncontrolled. The B-17's propeller blades snapped off as they struck the earth, and both wings smacked the ground before the fuselage skidded to a halt. Miraculously, the Flying Fortress did not break apart or burst into flames. It came to rest battered but largely intact, a crash landing in one piece, with 3 of its engines still faintly rumbling on. The astonished RAF crew braced for the bomber's crew to emerge, ready to help any survivors out of the wreck. They waited for over 15 minutes, expecting at any moment to see dazed airmen climbing out of the downed plane, but nobody came out. After some time passed with no apparent movement, Major John Crisp, one of the British officers on site, decided he had to investigate. Major Crisp cautiously approached the silent B-17, unsure what he would find inside. He even worried the abandoned bomber might be some kind of German booby trap or trick, given the unusual circumstance. The airplane's engines were still sputtering, so Crisp clambered onto the fuselage and managed to reach the controls to shut off the throbbing motors. With the roar of the engines dying out, an eerie silence fell. Crisp then found a hatch on the underside of the aircraft, opened it, and pulled himself up into the belly of the bomber. What he discovered upon entering would shock him. There was no one inside, not a single soul. The B-17's interior showed clear signs of recent occupation by a crew, yet the men themselves had vanished. To appreciate just how extraordinary this situation was, one must understand the typical role of a B-17 and its crew in World War II. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was a heavy bomber employed by the United States Army Air Forces, used primarily in the daylight strategic bombing campaign over Europe. These stout aircraft, each usually manned by a crew of 10, flew from airfields in England on long-range missions to hit German military and industrial targets. They were capable of striking factories, railway yards, and oil refineries deep behind enemy lines, destroying the infrastructure of the crumbling Third Reich. B-17 crews endured fierce opposition on every sortie. Flying at high altitudes and tight formations, they were met with relentless anti-aircraft fire and increasingly limited swarms of enemy fighters. In the early years of the campaign, before long-range fighter escorts became common, American bomber losses were brutally high. In late 1943, the average B-17 had a life expectancy of only 11 missions, and its crew's odds were no better. Over the course of the war, these flying fortresses dropped more than 640,000 tons of bombs on Axis targets, but this came at a great cost in men and machines. Some missions became infamous for their danger. For example, a single 1944 raid on the Mersburg-Leipzig oil complex was defended by 780 flak guns. In an astonishing fact, 56 American bombers were lost on that day alone. It wasn't uncommon for damaged bombers to limp back toward Allied lines, only to have their crews bail out when the aircraft could no longer stay aloft. Normally, however, if a crew had to abandon their B-17, the aircraft would eventually crash and be destroyed. None of the Allied soldiers in Belgium that day had ever seen a flying fortress make it back by itself, which is why the sight of that empty B-17 sitting in a field was so unbelievable. Inside the downed bomber, Major Crisp found plenty of evidence of its crew, but no crew members. Using a flashlight, he carefully moved through the fuselage and the cramped crew compartments. Later, Crisp would report that the most remarkable find was about a dozen parachutes wrapped up and ready to go. Every airman's parachute appeared to be present and packed, which made the absence of the crew even more baffling. If the men had jumped out, why were all their parachutes left on board? On the navigator's desk, Crisp found a code book and noted that the last entry scrawled in it read simply, "Bad flak." Scattered around were personal items, several fur-lined flying jackets, and even some half-eaten food. There were no signs of struggle or of any casualties. In fact, there was no blood and no damage from bullets or flak inside. Aside from the damage inflicted by the crash landing itself, the B-17 appeared surprisingly undamaged. This made the cryptic "bad flak" note even more puzzling, since whatever trouble the bomber had encountered in the air had left no visible holes or scars on the airframe. By this point, word of the strange crewless aircraft had spread among nearby Allied units. The abandoned flying fortress quickly earned a nickname, the Phantom Fortress. Investigators arrived to identify the ghost bomber and search for an explanation. They soon confirmed the plane's serial number and markings. It belonged to the 91st Bombardment Group, a veteran American unit based in England. The last mission flown by this B-17, before it decided to finish the trip alone, had been a raid on the oil refineries in Mersburg earlier that day. Somewhere between the target and Belgium, something clearly had gone very wrong. The pressing question remained: what happened to the crew? At first, some feared the men might have fallen out or met with a grim end. The untouched parachutes suggested that if anyone had bailed out during the flight, they did so without the very equipment that would have saved their lives. A breakthrough came not long after. Astonishingly, the entire crew was found alive and safe on the ground in Belgium. One by one, the American airmen from the Phantom Fortress were located and brought in by Allied personnel. Their appearance answered the biggest question. The men had parachuted out of the B-17 before it crash landed, but raised others. According to their report, the B-17 had developed a serious mechanical problem with its bomb rack while en route to the target, which prevented them from dropping their bombs. The pilots veered the plane out of formation to try to resolve the issue, but as they did so, they were hit by enemy fire. Bursting flak from German anti-aircraft weapons further damaged the bomb bay and knocked out at least one of the engines. The Flying Fortress began losing speed and altitude, unable to stay with the rest of the bomber group. With a crippled engine and possibly structural damage, the pilot set his sights on Allied territory in Belgium. As they crossed into friendly territory not far from Brussels, the pilot gave the order to abandon the aircraft. Following standard procedure, the pilot engaged the autopilot to hold the plane steady on a level course while the crew prepared to jump. One by one, all the crewmen clipped on their parachutes and bailed out from the struggling fortress at an altitude of about 2,000 feet. They all made it out successfully and their parachutes deployed. The men drifted down to safety and were soon rescued by Allied ground units who spotted them. The B-17, now completely unattended, surprisingly did not nosedive or spiral out of control as many damaged planes would. Instead, with the autopilot still engaged, the bomber continued to fly on its own. It slowly descended in a wide glide, maintaining a generally straight and level altitude. In an incredible twist of fate, the unmanned aircraft happened to come down near where Major Crisp's anti-aircraft unit was positioned. When Major Crisp compared the crew's story to what he found, some details didn't seem to line up neatly. The airmen had described serious flak damage and engine failures, yet the aircraft on the ground showed little evidence of battle damage. Those discrepancies were not unheard of in the chaos of combat. More puzzling was the matter of the parachutes. Crisp had found all those chutes neatly stowed, but the crew obviously had parachuted out. One likely explanation is that the parachutes Crisp found were spares, or crew chute packs that were left on board. Perhaps the crew grabbed different chutes, such as chest pack parachutes that attached to harnesses, and left the rest behind in their haste. It's also conceivable that in the confusion, Crisp tallied more parachutes than were actually standard issue for the crew. Whatever the case, the presence of unused parachutes on the Phantom Fortress has remained one of the quirks of the story. The fact that this B-17 landed itself without a crew was unprecedented, and there's no documented cases of it happening since. Some question if the mystery isn't how the plane landed, or the state of the plane and the parachutes, but whether this event happened at all. In my review of the evidence, I think it may be best to classify this one as based on a true story. A Flying Fortress did land itself in November 1944, and the crew did survive. However, everything else may be subject to embellishments over time, or to make the story more compelling. That said, to repeat a tired line that's overused for a reason, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. Toward the end of World War II, Allied pilots began reporting strange lights pacing their aircraft during nighttime missions. These unexplained aerial phenomena were first noted in late 1944 by crews of the U.S. 415th Night Fighter Squadron operating over Western Europe. In one notable encounter in November 1944, pilot Edward Schluter and his crew witnessed a cluster of bright orange lights flying alongside them near the Rhine River. The lights, numbering about 8 to 10, moved swiftly and with uncanny agility. Despite attempts to track them on radar or engage them in combat, the mysterious lights would vanish and reappear, seemingly playing cat and mouse with the astonished airmen. News of these encounters spread through squadrons and even reached the press. By New Year's 1945, American newspapers had picked up the story of what pilots were calling Foo Fighters. The term Foo came from a popular comic strip of the era, Smokey Stover, where a fireman character quipped, "Where there's foo, there's fire." And yeah, personally, I don't really get the humor either. I guess it was a different time. Radar operator Donald Myers, a fan of the comic, coined the name Foo Fighters for these bizarre flying lights, and it quickly became the label for this wartime mystery. After the initial encounters, reports of Foo Fighters were not isolated to a single squadron or region. Allied airmen across the European theater, and even in the Pacific, described similar encounters. The typical Foo Fighter sighting involved one or several glowing orbs or fiery balls of light-tailing aircraft at high speed. Pilots described them as red, orange, white, or even green lights that could appear singly or in groups, occasionally arranged as if in formation. They often seemed to toy with the airplanes, matching maneuvers, circling, and making sudden turns or bursts of speed, far beyond the capabilities of any known aircraft of the time. What made Foo Fighters especially eerie to the crews was that despite their visual presence, the objects never appeared on radar screens. They emitted no recognizable radio signals, dropped no bombs, and never fired weapons. In fact, these glowing pursuers never caused direct harm in any way whatsoever. Still, they unnerved even veteran aviators. Many pilots initially suspected these could be some new enemy weapon, a remote-controlled device or an advanced fighter meant to harass or disorient Allied flyers. Yet, attempts to outmaneuver or shoot at the lights were futile. Foo Fighters would simply dart away or vanish abruptly. Eyewitnesses across different nationalities found commonality in their stories. Beyond American and British crews, even some German and Japanese pilots reportedly observed similar inexplicable lights during missions. This broader pattern suggested that Foo Fighters were not the handiwork of any one side in the conflict. By late 1944 and early 1945, Foo Fighter sightings had become frequent enough that military leadership took note, and official inquiries were set in motion to solve the mystery. As the phenomenon gained attention, various theories emerged to explain what these Foo Fighters might be. Military authorities and scientists of the era considered a range of possibilities, from the ordinary to the extraordinary. One scientific explanation was that the lights were simply a natural weather phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire. This is a harmless discharge of plasma that can glow on aircraft wingtips or antennas during stormy conditions. St. Elmo's fire was familiar to pilots and sailors as a static electric effect that could produce a ghostly glow. However, many Foo Fighter sightings occurred in clear skies and described objects darting around in controlled ways, which did not fit the relatively static, flickering nature of St. Elmo's fire. Another weather-related candidate was ball lightning, an extremely rare and little understood spherical lightning manifestation. Ball lightning could, in theory, account for glowing orbs seen during thunderstorms. Yet, the Foo Fighters seemed to persist longer and move more deliberately than any documented ball lightning, which tends to last only seconds and doesn't chase airplanes over long distances. Further, ball lightning is extremely rare and doesn't travel in packs or respond with agency, as the Foo Fighters appeared to do. Psychological explanations were also put forward. Some suggested that war-weary pilots, exhausted from long missions and intense combat, might be hallucinating or misinterpreting ordinary lights as fantastical moving objects. Certainly, combat stress and fatigue can affect perception, and night flying can play tricks on even well-trained eyes. Indeed, the U.S. Navy was concerned enough to study night flying visual illusions in 1945, exploring how pilot fatigue could generate false sightings. However, this hypothesis of mere hallucinations didn't sit well with the airmen who experienced Foo Fighters. Many encounters involved multiple crew members seeing the same phenomenon simultaneously, which would be unlikely if it were all just in their individual minds. These pilots were also considered credible observers, skilled, alert men who, despite the stress of war, were capable of distinguishing optical illusions from real objects. They steadfastly refuted the idea that what they saw was a mirage or a result of battle nerves, especially given the consistency of reports across different crews and nights. Further, photographs of the Foo Fighters were also relatively common, indicating that at least some of the objects were more than mere hallucinations. Technological explanations abounded as well. Early speculation in Allied intelligence circles wondered if the Axis powers had developed a novel weapon or surveillance device. During World War II, Germany in particular was working on cutting-edge technology, including jet fighters and rocket-propelled aircraft. But those aircraft had distinct appearances and performance profiles, and none could perform the gravity-defying maneuvers attributed to Foo Fighters. These wonder weapons also didn't operate in the stealthy and radar-invisible way that characterized these glowing orbs. Furthermore, captured enemy documents and post-war interrogations of German scientists revealed no evidence of a secret program producing such phenomena. An alternative technological theory considered whether Foo Fighters could be a form of psychological warfare, perhaps bright flares or projected lights meant to confuse pilots. However, no one could explain the movement patterns of the Foo Fighters. With conventional explanations faltering, some turned to more exotic ideas. Even during the war, a few imaginative souls mused about otherworldly origins, suggesting that maybe these were visitors from beyond the earth, curious about our conflict. However, during the 1940s, such ideas were on the fringe and not taken seriously by military investigators. It was only after the war, especially with the flying saucer craze beginning in 1947, that people looked back at Foo Fighters with a new question. Curious minds began to question whether these were an early chapter in the modern history of UFO sightings. In hindsight, the resemblance is intriguing. Highly maneuverable lights and objects in the sky, defying easy explanation, playing tag with human aircraft. Indeed, many ufologists have claimed the Foo Fighters as part of the UFO phenomenon narrative, though this remains a controversial take. Over the years, a handful of writers even revived the speculation of advanced wartime technology, bordering on science fiction. For instance, stories about German Wunderwaffen and experimental flying discs have intertwined with UFO lore, though no concrete evidence ever emerged linking Foo Fighters to any such projects. By and large, the paranormal interpretation that Foo Fighters were extraterrestrial probes or spacecraft remained speculative and without proof. Yet the mystery around the wartime sightings certainly fed into the growing cultural fascination with UFOs. During and immediately after World War II, the Foo Fighter sightings prompted formal investigations. However, no conclusions were reached. Later, in 1953, as UFO sightings were garnering national attention, the CIA convened the Robertson Panel, a group of prominent scientists tasked with evaluating the UFO issue. Foo Fighters were directly mentioned in their deliberations. The Robertson Panel noted that they hadn't shown hostile intent and considered whether natural phenomena could explain them. They suggested possibilities like electrostatic charges similar to St. Elmo's fire, electromagnetic effects, or even light reflections off ice crystals high in the atmosphere. None of these explanations was confirmed as the definitive answer. The panel famously remarked that had the term flying saucer been popular in 1944 and 1945, those pilots would likely have called the Foo Fighters by that now familiar name. The lack of clear answers meant that Foo Fighters lingered as an open case. And so, scientists and enthusiasts have continued to revisit the mystery. In recent years, some researchers have taken a fresh look armed with modern science. According to one hypothesis, the balls of light might form under certain conditions in the thermosphere and then descend to altitudes where warplanes fly. It was theorized that they were drawn by the plane's own electromagnetic emissions, or by atmospheric disturbances like thunderstorms, or even the radiation from wartime events. Such plasmas could potentially move erratically and appear and disappear, which aligns with many Foo Fighter reports. All that said, we're no closer to an explanation of Foo Fighters today than we were in 1945.